Ahoy there, Junior Rangers, and welcome to New Brighton State Beach, one of 280 California state parks around this great state. If you've joined me before, you might know my name is Joseph. Hi. I've got the California State Parks bear all over my uniform. There's my name right there. There's a story to my name that we might touch on a little bit today. But anywhere you see this, that is a place that we as Californians take care of for everybody forever. And there you see one of my crazy curly hairs too. So I usually report to you from Seacliff State Beach. But as I've mentioned in those previous programs, some of you will remember, I don't just work there. I work at many of California's 280 state parks. And today, for the first time this summer, we're reporting from our next door neighbor, New Brighton State Beach. Specifically, we are tuning in from the campground, even more specifically, the Pacific Migrations Visitor Center. And that word right there, migrations, is what we'll spend the next, I always think it's going to be half an hour, but let's be realistic, probably 40 minutes. Looking into migrations. The many migrants to Monterey Bay show us how sometimes moving lets us live our best lives. So we got to tackle that word and what it means around Monterey Bay and in our California state parks. And we're going to head into the visitor center. But you see, I got my hat on today. Got the ranger hat on today, because we'll be spending some of our time outside as well, looking into migrations. So migration. Have you heard that word or anything like it before? Maybe you've heard of immigration or immigrants or migrants or migrating or migrate. All of those words have the same kind of root to them, that migra, that kind of thing in there. And when you hear that in any context, in any situation, anytime you hear migration, something like that, we are talking about things moving around. And when we talk about migrations around Monterey Bay and in our California state parks, we're usually talking about the movements of living things. And these can be one-way trips. They can be round trips where something leaves a place, goes somewhere else, comes back. Maybe they have several stops along the way. And sometimes it's a combination of the two. Sometimes migrations are not just seasonal or one way, they're generational. So we see this with the butterflies. I'll just go ahead and say that now. One generation will make one part of the trip, then their children will make the next part. And what we find with our butterflies around here is that the ones we see coming here every year are the great-great-grandchildren of the ones that were here last year, because their migration is so long. The path they take is so far. It takes, in the case of butterflies, several lifetimes to complete the cycle. Wow. All right, so if we've got our minds wrapped around migration and what that means, it's time for us to migrate into the Pacific Migrations Visitor Center, where I have the lights off, because we'll find it a little easier to see what we need to see. Talk about our worldly migrations. Migration usually means traveling a great distance. So let's just see how great and how far. All right, we're going to flip your camera around so you can have a nice walk in. Okay, here you are, Junior Rangers, heading into the Pacific Migrations Visitor Center at New Brighton State Beach. Duck under the oak tree here. Past the blackberries. I'm going to go up the steps. We also have a ramp. The many ways that people move, we have ways to get you into the visitor center. And pardon our dust, as we mentioned, we're not open to vehicle traffic, and we're taking you into a closed area. So I cleaned it up a little bit. Just enough to get the job done today. So, migration, the Pacific migrations. It can be one way, it can be round trip, it can be generational, and if it's generational, it's probably both one way and round trip. We noticed with and family, at the Pacific Migrations Visitor Center here, we're looking at who migrates around this ocean. So if this is a bit different from world maps you've seen before, it's a different looking at the world. It does use a funny projection, which makes like Russia and Alaska look simply huge compared to places like Brazil. it stretches things out. It's good for seeing direction, but it does make things in the far north and far south look much bigger than they really are. Stuff around the equator, like Hawaii, is generally the right shape and size. So that's Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Here's California over here. The Atlantic Ocean is over here, but we are only seeing half the world, not the usual hemispheres. And I'm afraid that England's on the other side. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's many ways that we divide up our world. There's something called the International Date Line. So over here in Alaska, it is, and this is all stuff that we just, time's an illusion, man. You might hear people say that. And it kind of is. We just kind of we have to make time make sense for us to do what we have to do. But something that's happening in Alaska at the same time as something happening in Kamchatka, just over here, and they're not really that far from each other. This is happening a day ahead of what's going on here in terms of our calendars and our clocks. In reality, we know that, if you call your friend in Kamchatka from Alaska, you're talking at the same time, just like it's dinner time for Brian and family in London. But, it's the same time. It's just how we measure our planet. It's weird, but I love geography. And so we'll look at this. So on one side of, this over here, it's Monday. Over here, it may already be Tuesday. So if you just hop from one island to the other, you're traveling through time, man. All right. International date line, we have to move it around a bit because, again, we're just kind of making time up, and we want Hawaii to be on the same day as the rest of the United States. And so you kind of move that line around so that it doesn't cut through countries too much. But that line and the kind of time we keep doesn't mean a whole lot to animals. But the kind of time that does it means something to us too, but what's really important to living things is the cycle of the seasons. And so that's what we're going to see here. I'm going to set a bunch of migrations going. And what you're going to look for is you're going to look for flashing lights. It's kind of dark in here, and that's on purpose. I want you to be able to see the lights of the migration. I'm going to quick check in and just see, okay, it doesn't look like I'm missing anything in the... Sometimes I see hands go up and I'm never quite sure what to do other than wave back. I'm still learning the technology too. All right, we were going to look at seasonal migrations of animals. And the thing is, if we showed you all the migrations of all the animals, this map would be nothing but glowing dots. We just focus on some of the flashier ones here. I don't know if anybody was here on the very first one of these I did back in June. And then again, a little bit later on a few other ones we touched on, there's a type of bird called the sooty shearwater. And when you look at just one bird, it's, let's see, let me see if I can show you. I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing today. Stick with me. There's one sooty shearwater. But you see up on the top, that kind of row of different things you could be searching for, what is the second thing you see? It's migration. But this is kind of a medium-sized seabird with really long wings and that hooked beak. So think about why they might migrate. And then you might remember just how far they do. Okay, so we're going to watch the sooty shearwaters, those birds. They fly in huge groups, which we'll cover later. They come on land. They are seabirds to the core. They only come on land to build nests and lay eggs and care for them. And they do that in the South Pacific. The ones we think of as visiting us come from New Zealand, we think, mostly. But there's some other Southern Pacific islands they come from. So let's watch the migration of the sooty shearwaters. Look for sparkling lights in the ocean. Do you see them around New Zealand there? And then, oh, look at that. Up to Japan, past Russia, past Alaska, down to California. And what are they following? They're following food. They find they have good nesting here during what we would call the Antarctic summer. They live where it's always summer. They're spending time down here in what is our winter. And then they go up here when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, and they're chasing their food. And if you had a good look at them and think about where they live, you can probably guess the shearwaters eat fish. Now they travel in groups of 500,000 sometimes. A bunch of questions came in. I froze a little bit ago. It's breaking up, froze. It's very glitchy. Okay. Well, we did our best. I'm still here. All right, so we were doing okay, and then we saw our whales as well. So you remember the shearwaters went from the southern Pacific all the way around the Pacific Ocean before coming home. So let's zoom in on California and see where whales go. These are gray whales, but our humpback whales use a similar route, but in a different season. But you see, with the gray whales, they spend their winters down in Baja California, part of Mexico, where it's pretty warm. That's where they have their babies. They travel to the Gulf of Alaska in the summer, where they eat some of the smallest things on Earth, little shrimp-like crustacean animals called krill, and they eat them by the millions because they have up here, kind of on the top of the planet, sometimes close to 24 hours of daylight, huge plankton blooms in the Gulf of Alaska, and then all the things that eat the plankton, the krill, bloom in a sense in the millions, and then the whales go up there, and that's what makes whales so big, is eating millions of some of the smallest animals on Earth. So that's the route of our gray whales. Humpback whales do something similar. They kind of come from Central America up to Monterey Bay. That's right where we are, right in the middle there. There's this Point Sur in San Francisco, that gap in the middle there. That's us. The humpback whales you saw in that video come here to eat the same fish that the shearwaters do, which is why we see them together at the same time. We mentioned one other type of animal that does not, the individuals don't make round trip migrations. They make one-way migrations, but by doing it with several generations, they do a multi-generational round trip migration. All right, I am going to try to share my screen one more time, but hopefully it's not quite as wild. We're just going to go look at a monarch butterfly cluster. Here you go. Now, our neighbors at Natural Bridges State Beach, they're going to cover butterflies more thoroughly than I ever do, but you just get the idea of just how many of these animals make this. And every one that you see is the great-great-grandchild of the ones that were here last year. Let's go back to Zoom. Stop that, join here. And let's look at the migrations of monarchs in North America. You'll see there's we've got all of North America shown here. Look for your flashing lights here. You'll see kind of white turning to orange. We see a path east of the Rocky Mountains. And they come from places. I originally come from Western Wisconsin. More on that later. They go to central Mexico. We don't see many of them moving across the Rocky Mountains. On the West Coast, they come down to California. Places like Natural Bridges is perhaps the most famous, but Lighthouse Field, we get them here at New Brighton as well. You get down to Pacific Grove, Pismo Beach. There are a number of places in California that are famous for their role in the migration of these butterflies. And then later, when we wrap up, we're going to talk about the role of people. Or the migrations of people. So there's the migrations of butterflies. There's the whales. There's the shearwaters. And then people follow ocean currents. So if we just look at 4 species, gray whales, sooty shearwaters, monarch butterflies, and humans, look at all the migration that's happening. So back to our butterfly friends. They depend on migrating trees. And wait a minute. You could fairly say, Joseph, are you losing it? Not quite. Trees, of course, grow where they're planted, which is sometimes the thing we suggest that people try. Well, sometimes people got to migrate too. We'll get to that later. Trees themselves don't migrate, but forests do. It's a generational migration. The next book I'm going to read is all about this, how forests move. We're going to go out to a forest that's only here because people helped it get here. So follow me outside. Love going outside and I love wearing my hat. Okay, follow me outside and we'll get to know some of our trees that have moved here because people brought them here. So I'm going to turn you around. Here's our beautiful Salvia California sage that we have here. We've got a number of trees around here. We'll start with the ones that have grown here without people's help. This kind of really branchy one here. And then the shorter one over there. And then there's a few bigger ones over here. Those are California coast live oak trees. Those would grow here whether people help them or not. Now, for reasons we'll get into later, people might have wanted to help them for a while. But that's pretty much the one tree-sized plant we would have here if it weren't for people bringing other ones here. So that's a migration of sorts, is the importation of species. And so the big tree that you see here doesn't come from too far away, but it only grows here because people moved seeds from the Monterey Peninsula and the Point Lobos Peninsula. There's another beautiful state park, Point Lobos State Reserve, down on the way to Big Sur, south of Monterey, where these grow naturally. And the biggest ones there only get to be about half that tall. And I was going to show you, but the screen sharing is being kind of glitchy, so I think I'll go ahead and lay off of that. Monterey cypresses grow bigger almost anywhere you plant them other than where they grow. Point Lobos and the Monterey Peninsula don't get as much rain as we get here. And the places where they grow are kind of rocky and windswept. And so the trees, while they live a long time, tend to stay kind of small. We have another tree that comes to us from Monterey. And so you see the ones with the bushy needles on them. Those are Monterey pines. Monterey pines grow a bit into Mexico, a lot kind of around here on the central coast. The ones we have here, these individuals look good. Monterey pines in California are having kind of a hard time because there's a bug that is eating them up. There's a thing that happens when we move animals around and plants around is sometimes we introduce pests when we don't mean to. That's what some people think that the butterfly's favorite tree is. And there's a good argument that those eucalyptus trees, those tall ones in the middle there with the kind of poofy tops on them, these are relatively small for eucalyptus trees, if you can believe it. The butterflies love these trees, and they make great habitat for our butterflies when they overwinter here. They come here for the winter. But they're big, messy trees that kind of crowd out other things that want to grow around here, including the native things like oaks. And so when you introduce things from around the world, it's kind of hard to tell. Are you doing something good or are you doing something bad? Maybe you're doing a bit of both. But in any event, they are here. We've had eucalyptus trees in California for just about 160 years. And I will show you just how big they can get. If you look way in the distance there, towering over the oaks and the nearby trees, you see way up here, that is a eucalyptus tree. They can be over 200 feet tall, and none of them in California are even that old. Some of the world's tallest trees are eucalyptus species, but the world's very tallest tree is a California native, but not native to New Brighton. A little too close to the coast, even for the coast redwood. But this is our state tree, and this is an example of the world's tallest tree, but it's kind of a young one. I'm about to turn 40. It's not a whole lot older than I am. But look at this. It just keeps going up, 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 up. So I mentioned that the trees that we have here are really, most of them are only here because people brought them here. So why would people bring the trees here? You notice we have our visitor center there. And even though it's New Brighton State Beach, we haven't seen the ocean yet. And I'm afraid I don't have Wi-Fi right at the ocean, so we're not going to walk all the way there. It would also take a while. But a long time ago, people started migrating for a few different reasons. Why do plants, animals, anything, why do they migrate? Maybe should have covered that earlier. Why do we migrate? Plants and animals migrate to where their life will be easier. Maybe it'll be easier for a season, or maybe it'll be easier for the rest of their lives. But they migrate to make their lives easier. Helps them live their best life, as we said. So trees were brought here by people who wanted some shelter from the wind and the fog that we get here on the coast. But the people were coming here to get away from the heat over the hill. If you go over the hill to San Jose today, or certainly into the Central Valley of California, it might be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit today. And that's really uncomfortable for most humans. And so for over 100 years, people have been coming to the coast to get some relief from that. And the people who owned this before it was a state park thought it might be nice to plant a bunch of trees so people would have shade and some shelter from the wind. And they tried a few different trees, and the redwoods and the eucalyptus, Monterey cypress, and the Monterey pine all seem to do quite well here. So who are these people that have migrated here? We'll go back into the visitor center to get to know them. So let's check in our questions and answers, see if I'm missing anything here. Edith said that she saw hundreds of birds feeding on fish. Yes, they kind of mob things, don't they? And they have a redwood growing in London, and that's not the worst place for a redwood to grow. If you go to Kew Gardens, you'll see some amazing American tree species growing there because particularly English people historically have done a lot of collecting for gardens. Cool. All right, let's go back into our visitor center and see what people have been doing around here. So off we go. Talk about how people migrate, why they migrate here. So you know that people come here seasonally, sometimes just for the day, sometimes to camp for a week. We're in a campground today, just a little bit away from the ocean. People come here to beat the heat. Some people move here for a better life, and they stay here. And some people have always been here. There we are. Hello again. So it's a little dark, but I found it was better with the lights off than the lights on. So even though the people pictured here, which are part of a large group of indigenous people to Central California's coast. So California's Central Coast, there's a term you hear us use, which is Ohlone people. The Ohlone people are not a single tribe. It's almost as broad a term as saying European or American. It's a number of people with related languages that have lived on the Central California coast for thousands of years. And sometimes when you hear people talk about indigenous Americans, people talk about them in the past tense. What I can tell you, what I've heard from indigenous Americans alive today is that they want you to know they are still here. Lifestyles may have changed, and certainly indigenous Americans are not the only people living here, but they are still here. Still of what makes California. For thousands of years, for most of human history, if this is a timeline and that's all of human history, take away about that much, and that's what's written down. Before we started writing down history with the arrival of Spanish people, who we'll talk about in a little bit, almost all of human history around here is the history of our indigenous people. So members of the larger Ohlone group. They migrated too. So we're talking about how they remember people have not disappeared. But before the contact with people from other parts of the world, the way Ohlone people lived was seasonally. They migrated seasonally. They would follow their food, and they would live in what we would think of as kind of a temporary shelter for a season before either taking it apart, or if it had a rat problem or something, just burning it down. It was just a tule reed hut, no big deal. And then they would rebuild somewhere else where the eating was good for that season. And so we talk about spring, summer, autumn, winter, seasons to a number of indigenous groups, including the larger Ohlone group, might be described as more like acorn time, salmon time, blackberry time, seed time. And so you would just travel to wherever the food was good. And there are many other indigenous groups all over California. California is believed to have the biggest indigenous population in North America before contact. The people who lived on the Central Coast were seen as particularly wealthy and well-to-do with a lot of spare time by people who lived inland, where conditions were, hotter, colder, harsher, drier. Seen as really wealthy people who had it really good. There was a lot of food around here. So you can see why other people from other parts of the world, once they figured out how to get here, would want to come here. And as we mentioned, the first group to arrive would be people of Spanish descent, and no small amount of indigenous descent from what is now Mexico as well. There's one big family called the Castro family, who owned almost all the land that people live on now here in Santa Cruz County. That's Martina Castro right there. She, 160 years ago, owned more land around here than anybody else at a time when the United States didn't land at all. The culture by way of Mexico comes up here with, tortillas are not a Spanish invention. They were picked up by on their way up from Mexico. They brought their tortillas and their cattle here. So this is a live in one place kind of lifestyle, but those cattle were brought with them. So the reason we have bulls and oxen and all that in the United States is because European people brought them here. And in California, it was the Spanish bringing them here, where they were raised for their hides to make leather more than anything else. So you have indigenous people and people of mixed Spanish and indigenous Mexican descent coming here. And then along the gold rush, and everybody comes here, and railroads come here, and things get really complicated. So people come here to live. They come from across the ocean. You remember that Kuroshio current? Sometimes people come here to do what they did where they came from. Sometimes people leave a place, not really because they want to, but because they hope they'll be safer where they go. Or maybe there'll be more work or more money. We had people arrive from China, mostly men, about 160 years ago. And they were having a hard time in China. They came here to fish. And they built, as New Brighton State Beach was once called China Beach, because there was this big group of people who lived here, and they built their home out of driftwood. And they lived here on the beach, and they caught fish and caught shrimp, and really developed the fishing bay. Now, the thing is, they kept moving because other people who were here, by this time, you've got people that married into the Castro family that come from other parts of the United States and Europe. And that becomes kind of the dominant culture. And sometimes the dominant culture can be really bullying. And what we found with our Chinese culture is they push further and further south because, well, we like to think of Santa Cruz County as a place right now. And it was not a very welcoming place to people immigrating from China, which leads us to our conclusions. Let's go have a look at our great big world one more time. So we've looked at just a few examples of migration today, but migration is a huge part of the story of our world. You think of where people come from, where they've been. If you look at your own name, there's probably a story there of migration. We'll use mine as an example because it's right here. I have a 3-part name. So my first name, Joseph. There are Osips and Jose's and Josephs, Yosefs, Yusufs. This name Joseph shows up around the world in a bunch of different forms, but originally, in my case, it's a Hebrew name. And I am not of Jewish descent, but I have this Hebrew name just because it's such a common name around the world. And my mother admired somebody named Joseph and named me after a couple different Josephs that she admired. My middle name is from Northern England. My last name is from Scotland. But those of you that remember me talking about the concrete ship, my family is more Norwegian than anything else. Doesn't make it into my name. And even though my name comes from parts of the world that aren't even on our map, I have lived my whole life in a country called the United States of America. I grew up 2,000 miles away from here in a place called Wisconsin. And I moved a little over 20 years ago, before you were born, to California. I've lived my whole adult life here. So my name is a story of people migrating around the world. And I am a migrant myself within the United States. This is like moving across Europe for people tuning in from elsewhere in the world. So it was a big change. It was a change I made because I just thought that I would have, I wanted to be by the ocean. They don't have an ocean in Wisconsin. I wanted a different life. And so I came out here to try it and I found I like it. And I've been here for over 20 years. There are more people living outside of their country or United State of birth than living in the entire United States right now. So migrants on Earth are so many of us. It's if you put together migrants within the United States with migrants around the world, you're looking at 300 million people out of about 7 billion on the planet. Big, big numbers. But the point is, we have a lot of people moving around for a lot of reasons. For hope of a better life somewhere is really what it comes down to. Maybe that's work, maybe that's a different political system, but people are moving. Maybe you've moved, maybe you're thinking about moving. It's a big part of life. And just remember, when we look at migration, this is it's one way to live our best life. So if it turns out that that's the best move for you, don't be shy about making the jump. I'm so glad I did. I'm also really glad you tuned in today. We talked about migration a whole bunch, and I got to wear my hat, which was extra fun. So I'm going to check in on questions and answers, and then I think we're going to wrap up. Let's see. Did I miss anything? No, nothing new. All right. Anything you want to get in before we say goodbye? All right. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me today from New Brighton. I look forward to joining you next week. We've got programs lined up all the way through the end of August, and we're going to finish with whales and sharks. So be sure to tune in. One question coming in. I'll see what that is, and then we'll say goodbye. Oh, I'm so glad that you're paying so much attention, Brian. We have to affirm or reaffirm, or in the case of some of us, take it for the first time. I should have this memorized, but I'm going to read the Junior Ranger Pledge, and we're all going to say it. So if you've said it before, we're reaffirming our promise to do good in the world as California State Park Junior Rangers. If you're joining us for the first time, these are a series of promises we'll ask you to make to finish today's program. Thank you, Brian in London. I'm not in my usual location. I'm a little off today. All right, so this will be a repeat after me pledge. You'll hear me say a few words, and then you want to say those same words with one important exception. When I say state your name, you're not going to say my Hebrew, English, Scottish name. You're going to say your own name. But other than that, just say the words that I say, and then do the things that you say. And you will earn yourself another digital badge stamp and all the various rewards that come with being a California State Parks Junior Ranger. So get ready to repeat after me. I state your name, promise to treat the earth and all living things with care and respect. Be careful of what I do and how it affects others. And learn about the importance of nature and our heritage. If you can do all that, you will have earned a digital badge stamp. Look for that in your email today or tomorrow. All right. Thank you. 1,000 times thank you to our friends tuning in from London. Notice that we're all speaking English, even though we're thousands of miles away from you. Yet another tale of just how big migration is in our world. All right, I think now we might be ready to say goodbye. Thanks so much. I'm so glad to have so many of you tuning in again. It's been a blast. Let's do it again next week. Bye for now.